Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with two very special guests. This is possibly the best interview that I've ever been a part of, and I'm so excited that we get to share this with you. Our first guest today is Morgan Jerkins, and she's here to share with us her new book, Wandering in Strange Lands. A daughter of the Great Migration reclaims her roots. Now, Morgan is the author of the New York Times bestseller, This Will Be My Undoing, and the senior editor at Zora. A visiting professor at Columbia University, Morgan's short-forms work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Rolling Stones, Elle, Esquire, and The Guardian, among many others. So let's welcome to the show, Morgan Jerkins.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here to talk about this book. I mean, once I picked up your book, I could not put it down. And I was just, some of it's so heartbreaking, some of it's infuriating. And, it for me, it was a great education. I think a lot of people are kind of feeling the same way.
Yeah, man, I am just shocked, and for many different reasons. There were many moments when I was writing the book that I just didn't think I was going to finish it. In fact, I had just an overwhelming fear that one day I would get an email from either my agent or the editors themselves telling me that my book deal was canceled because I couldn't make the story come together.
Oh my gosh. Well, reading this book, you would never believe that. I'm telling you, because you have woven this all together so beautifully. And, I have to ask you, maybe we just start at the beginning here. Like, what inspired you to write this book?
You are going to laugh, but I got inspired to write this book from a very famous movie that came out in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. It's Jordan Peele's Get Out. There is a climactic scene at the end where the black male character has his hands over the white female character's throat and the police car pulls up. And I'm sitting in Magic Johnson Theater in Harlem, and everyone gasps, collectively gasps. And I thought it was so fascinating because I had seen many films before in a movie theater with a lot of black people that, where there's a black a main black character or a film by a black person. And I'd never had this experience before. And I don't know if it was because, now we live in the age of the Black Lives Matter movement or what, but it astounded me. And I thought that I wanted to write a story about how intergenerational fear and trauma plays out in African Americans. And when I told this premise, if you will, to two black female scholars, Dr. Carrie Greenidge and Dr. Kendra Field, they're based in Boston. They told me, "Oh, you're writing a migratory story." By that time, I already had a book deal that, I wrote a book proposal based off of fear and trauma, and the drafts were not coming together. The draft started to crystallize just a tad when I went that route and started to speak about migration and displacement and how African American families are unifying and distinct because of time and distance and region.
I find it so fascinating how you have this dovetail with your own story. At what point did you decide you were going to intertwine your own personal journey in this?
It was after a come to Jesus moment. I remember I went through two full drafts of wandering, and it was not coming together. Even after I took the approach of the migratory story, I think I was still positing myself as a distant observer at of sorts. And after two full drafts, my agent sat down with me, and then we actually went to the office at Harper to speak to my editors. And it was when in there where they were like, you have to get personal again because, you're an African American. Was your family always based in Jersey? And I said, no, but I don't know much about their lives in the South. And they were like, well, there it is. And I didn't want to get personal again. After my first book, This Will Be My Undoing, it was extremely personal. And I didn't want to go there again. But I knew that if I didn't, the book would never come together. So it wasn't until later drafts that I started to interview my family members and intertwine, as you say, my story with the stories of families that I'd interviewed across the country.
When you look at it, I mean, your story is really the story of millions of people. And I think that's why so many people can really relate to Wanderings in Strange Lands because, I mean, you're talking about things that maybe most people aren't aware of or don't know, but there is this interwoven fiber that brings it all together.
Yeah, I mean, I studied comparative literature in college. And so I am always comparing things as best I can. I'm always trying to see the patterns and the similarities, the differences, the overlaps, the dialogues that are happening. And so this book, it was full of magic for me, for lack of a better word. When I started to peruse my transcripts and look through and see how I was going to structure the book, it was like these people were in conversation with other people and they never met them before. They probably never even heard of each other before. And the synapses started clicking in my brain and some things were hard to get together. But then there were other parts throughout the process where things just started to magically connect because we are connected on this American soil.
Well, and you bring up so much trauma that has happened. It's only in knowing this and shedding the light on it that we can ensure that stuff like this doesn't ever happen again in any way, shape, or form. And
Mm-hmm.
it's so important to talk about this and to know about it and to understand where these different things took place. And I think, I'm originally from California, moved to Colorado. I'm, on the East Coast. I mean, I travel around and some of the places you talked about in your book, I'm like, wow, I've been there. I never knew this about like Darien.
Right, right. But I didn't either. Like, there was so much about American history that I just did not know. And I hope that when people read my book, they don't feel ashamed of that. I've had both Black and white people tell me that there were things that they did not know about their own history. And I said, well, yeah, and it's purposeful, I'd argue. We don't learn about the structural forces of racism in history textbooks, at least not the public schools I went to. We are not indoctrinated to value Black lives and our histories on this American landscape as we do larger quote unquote American history, which is a history that centers white people at the expense of everyone else. And so, of course, there's going to be this unevenness. Of course, there's going to be this asymmetry in knowledge when it comes to what we do and do not know. And what I'm most concerned about is how this lack of knowledge or ignorance in certain aspects affects what's going on right now, whether it's in mainstream discourse, whether it's in our intimate spaces, or both.
Yeah, you mentioned that, there was, just in history altogether, and being able to have like historical markers in places where people are trying to petition to get those, like it makes it interesting just how difficult these processes can be.
Yeah, I mean, and are we shocked? I mean, think about how many Confederate monuments there are in the South, how we erect these public markers, and yet these people who we venerate have been so brutal to those who look like me. I mean, that's just an unevenness right there. Or the fact that I was just reading a story the other day about a woman, a white woman who had a wedding on a Louisiana plantation, and she's born and raised in Louisiana, and she did not know the history of slavery on that plantation or many other plantations. And it just blew my mind how just perverse that is. That it says so much about our country. It says so much about how much we obscure about the magnitude of slavery and how it ripples into the present day. And we just have so much work to do.
I think they should have your book really taught in either history and or literature in high school, so people can start having a curiosity about their backgrounds and about learning about history and about learning what's happened throughout our culture.
I would love that. I hope my book can be one document. I just want to make clear that I am working within a tradition, but I am working alongside other people who have been doing this work for longer than I have. Other people who have passed on already, but have made work like this possible. Like, for example, Zora Neale Hurston. Um, and I think that's the thing, right? Is what you said is spot on, is curiosity. All I was curious. I didn't know in the beginning where I was going to start. I didn't know where I was going to finish. I didn't know who I was going to interview. I didn't know who I was going to call into for help, but all I was curious about my own people, because I knew that there was a root there, pun intended. I knew that in spite of all that I did not know, that there had to be more beneath the surface. And I was intent on finding something.
Well, I'm so glad that you tugged on that and really dove into it, because I mean this story is one I feel that really needs to be told over and over and over and over again. When you were doing your research, what surprised you? What couple things surprised you as you were diving into just the book in total?
So much. I mean, where do I even begin? One of the things that surprised me was the fact that I didn't know that Black people accompanied Indigenous people on the Trail of Tears when Andrew Jackson forced Native American tribes with the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and the Seminole west of the Mississippi into Indian Territory, which is now known as Oklahoma. I did not know that Black people accompanied on that journey. I did not know that there were free people of color, free Black people who existed prior to emancipation. I didn't know that there were Black slave owners, thousands of them actually, and I didn't know that they even existed. So those were the things that really surprised me. Some of the things.
I can imagine just uncovering all this. What did you find out about your family that really shocked you as you were going through and pulling all this history together?
It's an overlap, but the way that I was taught was that, you know, Black equals slave and white equals master during slavery time. I didn't know, as I mentioned earlier, that free people of color existed. And my family was comprised of enslaved Black people, slave owners, and free people of color, and free people of color who were also slave owners. And that was a difficult history to contend with because I had never been taught these complexities. I had never been taught that somewhere along this racial hierarchy or there's a spectrum in the middle or somewhere oscillating in the middle where this access to power and capital and cultural and social capital within the plantation economy was not always reserved to white people. They may not have had as much as them, but it wasn't always reserved to them in certain places, like in Louisiana. And that was a huge shocker to me.
I know in your book you talk about food What initially intrigued you about food that you wove that into this story as well?
So I didn't know where else to start but food, because I felt like food is such a unifying force in Black families. I can get soul food in Los Angeles. I can get soul food in New Jersey, Texas. I can get it anywhere in the United States. And within that category, I was like, okay, so what is there about food that has intrigued me? And one of it was this tradition we do every year, which every New Year's Day, we have collard greens for money and black eyed peas for good luck. And when I asked my mother why we did this, she said it's just something we do. And I knew that that wasn't true. You don't just do something. Um, and when I researched that this superstitious type tradition stems from the Low Country, and particularly from a sub-ethnic group of African Americans known as the Gullah Geechee people. And the Gullah Geechee people are so important because they are the group of African Americans that is said to have retained the most West African cultural traditions due to the location, the way in which their enslaved ancestors outnumbered the slave masters, and also because they were less susceptible to disease than the white people who resided there. And so when I pulled in all these different factors, I said, okay, that's where I'm going to start, which is the Low Country.
Well, it just was interesting how you brought that all together and really kind of gave it this place to start where people can really relate to, because we all come around the table and it's these questions that you're asking. It's like, where does this come from? How does
Mm-hmm.
this relate to my story? I was really intrigued by.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. And it's so cool to when people ask me about like, why did you start with food? And I was like, how could I not start with food? And I even mentioned this in my book. Um, Food is anytime I sit down, for dinner with my family, that's like 300 years worth of history on the dinner table. And that's lovely to me.
Oh, that's amazing. It's nice because we when we look at how this brings everybody together and just the warmth that brings. I mean, there's a lot of stories there I think people have around food and recipes with their family, but it's just not about that. It's the bigger, deeper story of why we believe some of the things we believe and why we use maybe some practices that maybe other people don't. And there's also, I know you have it interwoven in your book as well, that talks about water and how African Americans feel about water.
Yeah. Um, it that was a hard topic for me to write about because it's such a it's so complicated. And even when I was writing the drafts of this book, particularly that chapter about water, I was like telling myself, like, yes, it is a draft, but you really need to be delicate yet so in depth about what water constitutes because it constitutes so many different things. And Yeah, it was an experience in and of itself just talking about water.
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of beliefs that go around water, and you did such a good job bringing that together where maybe there's some beliefs, some folklore, but also some real deeper, like a deeper meaning and understanding around water and just what it means for people. Because you talk about also just people dying and how that also may affect the consciousness and the extended trauma that people are feeling from that.
Right. I mean, on the one hand, water represents transformation with regards to like baptisms. It can represent freedom. If you think about the Ohio River, separated slave territory and freedom territory. So people wanted enslaved black people wanted to flee. Um, they would use the water many of times. You can also think about in Gullah Geechee culture, many of their cemeteries are based near the water because there's this belief, or facing the water rather, because there's this belief that when we die, our souls go back to Africa in the afterlife. But then On the other hand, water can represent destruction. Think about the transatlantic slave trade. Think about the Atlantic Ocean that captors used to bring enslaved Black people to the colonies. And some historians say that the Atlantic Ocean is a floating graveyard. Water can also represent disappearance. Water can also represent just contamination, lead contamination, Flint, Michigan, Newark, New Jersey, even in the low country. Again, you see this rippling effect that's happening. And this separation between land and water, and also just structural forces of racism. Segregated pools, for example, that's a huge one. It exists along a continuum. And that's something that I really wanted to elucidate in that chapter.
I mean, we can even look as recent as like Katrina and how there was
Yeah,
really like an uneven, response to such a disaster. And people today still haven't recovered from that.
exactly. Exactly.
Mm, it's just heartbreaking. But it's important that again we know what's happened in the past so we don't make those same mistakes. I
Right.
mean, I think education and knowledge can go a long way for people to not only understand and have a greater knowledge about what people are going through, but also how can we not repeat this in the future.
Right. Right. And I think it's to get serious. You know, what's so interesting about when it comes to slavery and when it comes to just the devastation that has been brought upon Black communities, it's almost as if we just don't want to talk about it. Not we, but just the public as large. We're meant to get over it, but then we wonder why riots keep happening. These cases of police brutality keep happening. Um, we keep seeing this cycle, and I personally believe that we see this cycle, yes, because of white supremacy, but we also see this cycle because we, as a nation, are not reckoning with the vast devastation that has been thrust upon Black people in our communities. And because we're not facing it head on and addressing it, its roots and its effects and how these effects they come into the present day, even though, slavery was ended over 100 some years ago, which by the way isn't that far away. If we don't reckon with that, we're just going to be we're going to be still persisting in this cycle, and it's exhausting. You know what I mean?
Yeah, without a doubt. And you look at everything, you're like, okay, the cycle's happening. I mean, do you feel that knowing what we do today, that maybe our society now is more ready to deal with these hard questions and these hard, things that we've been kind of throwing in the closet and pretending not to look at?
I'm not sure, because I think about all the backlash that has been happening because of 1619 Project, because the fact that a Black woman with a huge institution behind her decided to educate all of us about how much slavery has steamrolled this entire nation. And white people were so upset about it. And we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves why. I made a tweet the other day that said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, it's fascinating that white people do not know what white people have done to terrorize Black people. And I got a DM from a white man literally today in my Instagram telling me to burn in hell, calling me the racist. You see?
Oh, wow.
And it's like, I know where this response is coming from, because when Black women speak the truth, people don't want to hear it. People are upset that whatever we say shatters their innocence, shatters their reality, or undermines it. And they get violent, whether, epistemic violence, whether it's through conversation or actual violence. And so I don't know if we're ready. I am thankful for is that there is a space for books like mine to exist. There is a space for projects like the 1619 Project exist. But the backlash keeps happening. It keeps happening. And it's because of white supremacy, because of racism, and it's also because folks just aren't educated. And you see, we have this fork in the road, right? Someone like you can read this book and have no idea what was going to happen when you read it, have no idea about certain things in history, and you feel enlightened. Someone else might read my book and they can feel enraged, not at the information that they've never known, but at me for even talking about it and seeing me as a disruptor. And I'm curious about that. You know what I mean? I'm curious about that as well. Like when you get confronted with information that has been researched and that has been fact checked and looked over, that has been lived, the experience has been lived, and people still try to silence you. What does that say?
Yeah, it says a lot about a society that maybe is, not, maybe they're not ready to hear, but there are a lot of people who are. There are a lot
Right.
of people who are in the streets who are lending their voice saying, you know what, we need change and we need it now. And I
Yeah.
think that that's so important, and books like yours. I mean, you're right. When I went to school, they didn't teach any of this. I had no clue,
I
and it's been an education in many ways. And I am willing to learn. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what, people who share this planet with us have gone through in this country, most especially.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm thankful to have conversations like that. I'm thankful. So that's what I want is to have more conversations and to just let's have these confrontations too. Not just conversations, let's have confrontations. They're important.
Probably peaceful ones, right?
Oh yeah. Well, definitely. These are no, of course. But just to be confronted with foreign, confronted with unexpected information, unknown information, but to not shy away from it, but instead to let it fill us up so that we can move forward.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's only when we understand somebody else's truth that we understand who we are as a society. I
Yep.
mean, right now we are living half truths and half lies.
Uh-huh. Right.
It's just it's heartbreaking. What's interesting is books have such a journey. By the time you write it, you do the research, you're doing all this work to bring it together. And then here we are in the time we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's funny because my book was supposed to come out in May, and my editors asked if we could push it to August, and I was like, sure. And then the protests happened, and people were asking me like, how do you feel about that? And I was like, I don't know how to feel. I mean, I didn't expect for this to happen. None of us did. um but it's interesting because when I was in California, which was the last stop of my journey, I was at the intersection of Florence and Normandy, which is the start of the 92 riots, and I was with an underground rapper who witnessed it. He was a child, but he witnessed it. And I asked him, I said, do you think this is going to happen again? And he said, and I'm going to paraphrase it, if we do not reckon with what this country has done to Black people, it will happen again. And sure enough, 2 years to the day when he said that, that's when the George Floyd protests happened. So, yes, I would love to have a conversation about the riots and how it relates to my book, but it's sad that it has to be this way.
Yeah, without a doubt. Well, I know your book is going to help a lot of people have a greater understanding, in regards to African Americans and just in general. What do you want people to take away from your book?
I just want them to take away of how much Black people have endured, even after, whether they stayed in the South or they fled to different places. I want people to understand what Black people were up against. I want people to understand the magnitude, as I said, the magnitude of the devastation that had been brought upon our communities. I want them to understand the cyclical nature of state violence. So when we have these conversations about police brutality or police surveillance or land displacement, that this book will serve as a document to say exactly why that is. I also want people to be more curious about their own family trees, their own lineages, however knotty or entangled they are. And I also want people to think about the history that we have been taught and the history that has been purposely erased throughout the years and what that has also done to Black communities.
I think going through our own history, we'll find out we're more connected than we ever realized,
Yeah.
My goodness, Morgan. I mean, we haven't even touched your book. I mean, it's just such a great book. I really enjoyed it. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn about your work?
You can follow me on at Morgan Jerkins on Twitter. On Instagram, it's just _ Morgan Jerkins. And those are my website right now. It's actually being redone, but it's just morgan-jerkins.com.
Well, Morgan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Morgan. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Wandering in Strange Lands. A daughter of the Great Migration reclaims her roots. Wandering in Strange Lands is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. You'll want to stay with us for our next special guest, Bina Venkataraman, who's here to share with us her new book, The Optimist Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special, when you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 123 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. We're here today with our next special guest, Bina Venkataraman, and she's here to share with us her new book, The Optimist's Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. Now, Bina is the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe. Before joining the Globe, she served as a senior advisor for climate change innovation in the Obama White House. Bina was the director of global policy initiatives at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. She taught at the program on science, technology, and society at MIT and is an alumni of Brown University and Harvard Kennedy School. So let's welcome to the show, Bina Venkataraman.
Thank you so much for having me on, Marianne.
You know, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this new book. And I have to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Part of it was just a realization that in my own life, I was not so good at thinking ahead, not so good at heeding early warning signs, and there are plenty of examples of that. But realizing there was an echo of that, of my own inability to think ahead often, whether saving for the future or taking care of my health, and what we do as a society so often, whether it comes to climate change or the pandemic, or our failure to kind of act on warning signs of financial crisis. And it really, at first, started out as sort of a conclusion that I think a lot of people make, which is to think, oh, it's just not possible for humans to plan for the future. We're just short-sighted creatures. We're the descendants of hunter-gatherers on the plain, and we can't be expected to really plan ahead. But that sort of conclusion, I think, was too facile. It was too easy to kind of rest on that. And it led to more and more curiosity about, well, there are people who do think ahead. There are even communities and societies that have managed to act for the sake of the future, whether it's eradicating polio or putting humans on the moon. But how do they do it? Why do they do it? What are the conditions that allow people to think ahead? And that led me down a road of researching all different kinds of fields of psychology, biology, economics, but also traveling around the world and finding examples of people and communities that are in fact acting for the sake of the future, to try to understand how we can do more of it and what lessons there might be for the rest of us.
Well, it seems that when you talk about this, it's a life skill that people can really develop if we put our minds to it, maybe, individually, as a society, and as a culture. Is that what you're kind of getting to at the point of this book?
Yes, I think it's a myth that human beings are cursed to short-sightedness. What I found in researching the Optimist Telescope is that there are a number of tools we can use to claim the ability to think ahead, to exercise foresight in our lives, to exercise it in our communities, to even exercise it in our societies. And human beings might be the only species capable of this kind of thinking ahead. In fact, we know that we're the species that created civilization, that planned ahead to chart the seasons, to sow seeds to be harvested at a later date, to invest in our own education. So we have this capacity to think ahead. And perhaps we need to, more than ever in our world today, be able to plan for an uncertain future, to be able to look ahead and make wise decisions. And so the book is really about how we do that.
So what things do you think we should be focusing on now as a society?
Well, as a society, I think it's clear that we face a lot of challenges. We are driven by instant gratification. Our economy turns on near-term stock prices and quarterly profits from companies. Our politics is really focused on incremental actions of political leaders, whether it's tweets that our president makes or the most recent news story. And that all kind of leads us to be focused on immediate noise. Some of these issues are urgent. Obviously, we're in a pandemic right now. Obviously, we're in an election year, and there are real reasons to be active and concerned and focused on getting things done on these issues. But if we neglect what's around the corner, we should be thinking not just about this pandemic, but about how to prevent the next one, which could be an even deadlier disease than the one we're fighting today. We can't hope to just avoid future threats. Climate change is a major threat that is not just around the corner, but with the wildfires burning in California this week and super intense hurricane bearing down on the Gulf Coast, I think it's clear that we are already in a warming world where there are threats of, you can't call them natural disasters anymore because they're human induced, because humans have contributed to climate change. And we have to get our heads around what kind of society we want to live in, not just what we want to avoid. So one of the insights from the book is that when people just have a lot of fear of the future, when they just anticipate that doomsday is coming, that there's going to be biblical floods and a refugee crisis, it's really hard to engage with that future and feel like you want to think about it, right? Why not just party like there's no tomorrow if tomorrow looks pretty bleak? So it's really important when we think about these issues, whether it's the future of our democracy, how we want our neighborhoods to look, to be able to envision it in a concrete way and in a positive way, to say to ourselves, what does it look like to have a cleaner neighborhood, a safer neighborhood that is dealing with the risks of climate change, where neighbors take care of each other during heat waves or storms? What would that look like? And how would we make decisions today to make that come into being? And that's a way to plan ahead for the future that involves us having and claiming our own agency to shape the parts of the future that are in our control.
Yes, if we don't make a plan, I mean, it's just going to, do its own thing. And so having, I think, the foresight in developing a plan for the future, as you're talking about, for the next pandemic, for the next disaster, isn't really something that we should kind of think about, something we should do.
Absolutely. It starts with thinking about it and taking it seriously, but then it leads you right into making a plan. And one of the techniques I talk about in the book for helping us to imagine the future is to write a letter to your future self to be opened, a few decades from now, a decade from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, or if you want, to a child or to a grandchild or a niece or nephew. And the idea being that we spend so little time in our minds inhabiting the future. We think so much about what we need to do tomorrow or next week, the immediate future, but we really don't think a lot about how we want to be remembered, for example, or what we want to have accomplished at the end of our lives, or what we hope the world will look like for the people in our lives, the young people in our lives, who we know will be here for the generations to come, for the decades to come. So giving yourself the ability to imagine that by writing a letter, it's sort of a practice of what I think of as imaginative empathy, where you try to relate to yourself or another person in a future environment, can help you to conjure some of those vivid sensory details of the future that will help you kind of escape the trappings of the present and put yourself in that mindset. Another technique I talk about in the Optimist Telescope is prospective hindsight. And this is a technique that businesses can use, people in communities can use. You can use it in your own life. Governments can use it when planning for disasters like pandemics. And the idea is to imagine something as if it's already happened in the future. You can take a negative scenario and you could take a positive scenario. I usually recommend doing at least one of each kind. And then try to pretend like it's already happened. So if you're doing this in your life, you could be pretending that you got a really successful project done that you've been wanting to do for years. And then ask yourself, what are all the reasons why and how it happened? Make a list for yourself. It happened because I worked hard. It happened because this came to being. And it allows you to identify which of those decision points are yours to make. Which are the things you can influence about that future, and which are the things that are out of your control and aren't worth worrying about. if you do this also for negative scenarios, it's a way of helping to generate possible ways that your effort could fail or possible blind spots. So suppose an investment goes really, really badly for a company. Well, what are the reasons why and how that happened? By generating a list in advance with this technique of prospective hindsight, you can give yourself the ability to anticipate failure modes that often don't come to mind when you merely just hope for the best or start putting a plan into motion.
I love the story in your book of your friend who was really obsessed about how many steps she would take on a daily basis, and because the company gave out Fitbits. I'd love for you to share that with our listeners.
Sure. So she was in a fitness competition with Fitbits at work, and they were getting rewarded. Their team could go in the lead and win some sort of prize. I'm not sure exactly what the prize was, by getting the most steps of any of the groups of employees. And I ran into her one day while she was out taking her steps, and she, I'd run into her before, and I just said, "Well, how's it going? How's the step competition going?" And she was kind of bemoaning it. And she said, "Well, our team is broken into the lead. We have a lot of steps, and I'm always taking these long walks as breaks, including lunch breaks. But every time I go for this walk, I'm going to this bakery, this delicious Israeli bakery that was in Kendall Square, is still in Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm getting these pastries. And so I'm actually gaining weight." And so I just thought, I felt bad for my friends, but I also just found it to be such a great illustration of how sometimes we can be measuring ourselves on something very short term, whether it's the number of messages or emails you've cleared out of your inbox or those number of steps you've taken. But if you could actually at the same time be doing something that's detrimental to your own long-term goals. And so it's really important to think about what you're measuring and whether the measure actually reflects what you hope to accomplish.
Oh my gosh, I've done the exact same thing where I've gone and emptied my mailbox and realized later on, like, oops, I really needed something there.
Right.
I think most people go through that. Well, when we talk also, just in regards to, it seems like humans have had this obsession with predictions for eons. How have machines played a role in that?
Yes. So the obsession with predicting the future goes way back. We know to the ancients. There were the oracle bone readers and, all of the ways of prognosticating about the future, from Nostradamus to fortune tellers. But in our current environment, our current era, we have, with scientific tools, actually improved our ability to predict certain kinds of aspects of the future. For example, hurricane forecasting and weather forecasting have become vastly more accurate. There are tools of data analytics, technologies enabled by sensors and satellite networks that allow behavior to be predicted, including what kind of products certain consumers will buy. How outbreaks spread have been one of the ways that that science and technology have allowed us to understand. So our predictive powers are actually getting better in this era, but the cautionary tale that I would offer is that sometimes you can have robust predictions, but that's not the same as having good judgment to use those predictions to make decisions about the future. And I tell a story in the book, for example, about a very well-educated person who knew the forecast of Hurricane Katrina, understood how bad it was going to be, but just by virtue of not taking it seriously enough, by not being able to fathom and imagine that future and use judgment, ended up clinging to the roof of his house in 100-mile-per-hour winds as the waters rose all around him because he didn't evacuate. And he was a person who actually had the resources to evacuate, which we know not everyone in New Orleans and the Katrina struck region did. But so it's really not the case that just because we have information about the future, we're always going to act in the way we need to use it. And this pandemic is a good example of that, where there were early warning signs. There were lots of experts who talked about a pandemic like this happening over the course of years. But people in government, in leadership, didn't take it quite seriously enough. And part of that is the imagination gap between what we perceive in the present and what's possible in the future. And there are tools we can use to sort of bridge that gap, help us imagine futures we've yet to experience. One of those tools that I participated in, I went to the Stanford Virtual Reality Lab while I was researching this book and swam in a virtual coral reef. And suddenly the coral reef was flashed forward to the year 2100, and the coral had died and the fish were gone. And I had this sort of simulated experience of being in the future, being able to see a scenario in the future that I wouldn't have been able to see in the present. And I think we have to think about using our technology to help us not just get information about the future, but to have the kind of empathetic, imaginative experiences that will actually allow us to and inspire us to act better by the future.
I think that must have been such an impactful experience because a lot of people don't even give thought to how is this affecting my environment? How is this going to affect my neighborhood? And to have an experience like that where you're actually, kind of immersed in it, that must have just been astounding.
Well, it was. And the researcher behind this experiment of the coral reef experiment did a study where he showed that people who swam in this simulated coral reef that got to experience it in a more lush, colorful, vibrant way, and then have it flash forward to the future, that the people who had that experience in virtual reality actually had more sustained interest in what's happening to our coral reefs with ocean acidification and the warming of the world's oceans, which is threatening them. They had more concern about that, and it sustained for a longer period of time than people who watched a documentary or merely read about the threat to the coral reefs. So the difference here is it's not just getting information about a future threat. It's actually getting to have some sort of vivid sensory experience that allows us to, again, empathize with the future in a way that we don't in our daily lives.
You mentioned earlier about instant gratification. How is that really hurting us as a society?
Well, if you think about what it's like to be in a casino and be at a slot machine and get reinforced. So if you've ever been in a casino or by a slot machine, you'll know that they're very colorful, vibrant machines. And as you sit there and you put your coins in this machine, you get rewarded with bells and flashing lights and music and the sense that you've just missed getting that reward. In a lot of casinos, if you sit there long enough, they'll ply you with free snacks and free drinks to gratify you so that you keep sitting there. And there are a lot of people, there's an anthropologist named Natasha Schull who studied this, who will sit there and through their addiction to that instant gratification, it sets up what's known as a compulsion loop. And will squander their life savings or even, their earnings, just sitting there and being lulled into that pattern. Now, that's a very extreme environment, an extreme example of instant gratification culture where you're just being locked, your focus is just being locked on that next immediate reward. But this kind of cycle of a compulsion to seek the next fix, that immediate gratification, is also similar, and it's echoed in the design of our technologies. So smartphone technology, social media platforms that reward you with those likes or retweets or just the sound of getting an incoming text message. That can become similarly addictive for all of us. We don't have to be particularly vulnerable to come to think of that as something we want and crave. And that can often come at the expense of doing things that matter to us more. Maybe that involves exercising, or maybe that involves working on a long-term project, but you're going to spend more time on those sort of incremental, just getting the instant gratification because it's right there in front of you. It also can be a distraction from our long-term goals. So when you're just caught up in that loop and you just want the next thing and the next thing, you might not realize, right, that there's another kind of threat. There's something else happening, because it's sort of blocking your awareness of broader possibilities.
It's so interesting. Books have such a journey, from the time that they're written to going through the publisher and then being ready for print. Why do you think, because it seems that your book is so impactful to the readers that are picking up your book and people are spending time with you. As we're going through this pandemic, why do you think that people are just so attracted to your book?
Well, I think that there's something in it for everyone, in a sense, in that people care about the future. If you ask people what matters to them the most in life, you'll find that people will say their kids or their grandkids or their nieces or nephews or the kids they teach in school. The people will often use young people or some sort of connection to the future as an example of what they care about the most. People who don't have that often will talk about something they want to accomplish in the future or do in the future. So we are future-oriented creatures and beings. And I think people recognize that they have a value and an aspiration to do right by future generations, to do right by themselves, but that it's so difficult to do in our culture, in our environment today. And the book has research, it has tools, it has stories, really, of people who've managed to think ahead. And it offers, I think, a bit of hope in this moment where so much of the future can seem uncertain. The future can seem bleak, depending on where you're looking and what you're paying attention to. And the book is really about the possibility we have to reclaim our future, to shape it for the better. And it draws on history, it draws on stories from around the world to show that there is an art of the possible here.
You've done so much fabulous research for this book. Was there anything that really stood out to you as you were writing?
One of the things that I loved the most was spending time in Kansas with a farmer in his 80s now named Wes Jackson. And he was almost like a farmer poet. Every other word that came out of his mouth seemed to have an extraordinary wisdom to it. And what he's working on in Kansas, and the reason I wrote about him in The Optimist Telescope, is that he's trying to reconcile the very distant future as an older person with the present. So he's been working on developing perennial grains with his colleagues at a place called the Land Institute. And the idea is that our current annual crops of corn and wheat and sorghum really deplete the fertile topsoil of farms and the land. And they're going to make it more difficult to feed growing populations of people in the world in the future. And that perennial crops, just like perennials in our gardens, have deeper roots and come back year after year and might actually be better for the landscape and for protecting that fertile topsoil for future food. But that it's hard to reconcile that because people want to eat today and they want to get those high yields from those annual crops that are grown today. And I think what I loved about spending time with Wes, who's both a farmer and a scientist, and as I said, also kind of a poet, is that he was thinking creatively about how to get past this conundrum where sometimes what's in our short-term interest is not at all in our long-term interest, and vice versa. He was really thinking around that to sort of try to reconcile what's good for the long term of foods and the planet and for farming in the future with what farmers want to do today and what their businesses are requiring them to do today. And for me, it just was an example of the extraordinary human ingenuity that often gets overlooked as we look at our crises that we face today, and that we just absolutely have to tap if we want to try to solve some of our biggest problems.
I'd agree with you. I feel like your book offers so much hope for people and also innovative ways for them to look at our future. Because I think right now, so many people may look at it in this kind of bleak, like, there's not much we can do kind of stance. And that's not really helpful.
Right. I think it's important to look with clear eyes at the future and not sanitize the threats of the future and assume everything will be okay. But if we don't imagine the future being possibly better, there's kind of no reason to keep going. We have to be able to think of how the future could get better and what decisions we can make to get us as close to that as possible. While we'll never be able to control everything about the future and we'll never be able to see it perfectly, we can make better decisions today. We can make wiser decisions today. And part of how we do that is enhance our ability to imagine what lies ahead.
So, Bina, where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work and your book?
Well, it'd be great if you are interested in the book. It's called The Optimist Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. You can find out more about it and about me at writerbina.com. So it's the word writer and my name, Bina. You can also find me on the opinion pages of the Boston Globe, on the editorial page. And you can find a lot of our work, the work of a team of great, thoughtful journalists there.
Well, Bina, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Marianne. It was a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you, Bina. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Optimist Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. Again, if you'd like to pick up a copy of The Optimist Telescope, it's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, it's available on Kindle. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.